You're just a janitor's kid. Stay in your lane." The words hit like a slap. The courtroom wasn't loud, but the silence that followed was deafening. Everyone turned to stare. Judges, clerks, reporters, even the bailiff paused. All eyes were on her, a 17-year-old girl. Tight black curls, worn-out Converse, a faded backpack that looked way too small for the weight she carried inside. She stood next to the defendant's table, not as a witness, not as a relative, but as someone who had just demanded the court to hear her motion. And the opposing attorney? He laughed, right before tossing her papers on the floor. "This isn't a school debate, sweetheart," he scoffed. "This is real law." But what he didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that she wasn't there to play law. She was there to finish what her father started before he was fired, disgraced, and left to clean toilets in the very courthouse he once believed in. She had studied everything, quietly, ruthlessly, obsessively. Because her father's case, it wasn't just mishandled, it was buried. And tonight, while the city slept, she found the one piece of evidence that could rip it all wide open. Now, in front of a courtroom packed with people who thought she didn't belong, she was about to take on a bar-certified, three-piece suit-wearing legend of the legal world. And she wasn't going to flinch, not even when the judge leaned in and whispered, "You sure you want to do this, kid?" She looked up, her voice steady, eyes burning with something no law school could teach. "Your Honor, I'm ready." Because this wasn't just about proving them wrong. This was about proving her father was right all along. And by the end of the trial, the truth wouldn't just come out. It would change everything. Her name was Imani Grace Holloway, born and raised in Durham, North Carolina, in a part of town where streetlights flickered more than they worked and buses ran late if they came at all. Her mother passed when she was 6, a stroke, sudden, cruel. Her only parent after that was Elijah Holloway, a courthouse janitor who used to be a legal clerk before he was accused of leaking documents and swiftly demoted without trial, without a voice. But he never lost his dignity. Every day, Elijah would lace up his beat-up work boots, straighten his faded ID badge, and mop the same marble floors he once walked in dress shoes. And every night, he would come home with stories, not bitter rants, but lessons in justice, ethics, and resilience. Imani listened, not like a child listening to bedtime stories, but like a future warrior absorbing every word. By 12, she had memorized key rulings in constitutional law. By 14, she could quote obscure case precedents better than most first-year law students, not because anyone taught her, but because she taught herself. She had no mentors, no fancy tutors, just her father's discarded law books, the public library, and a fire inside her that refused to burn out. Their home was a rented 2-bedroom unit above a pawn shop. The wallpaper peeled, the faucet dripped, but the dining table? That was sacred. Every evening, they sat across from each other, books open, notepads scribbled full, legal dramas playing in the background like white noise. Elijah never pushed her to follow his path. But Imani saw what injustice did to him, and she vowed, never again. At school, she kept her head down. Honor roll. Mock trial team captain. But while other students were thinking about prom, she was thinking about how to file a habeas corpus petition. She knew things, and she saw things, especially the silence around her father's case. People stopped talking when she entered the room. Court clerks avoided eye contact. Files mysteriously went missing, but she noticed. She remembered. She wrote it all down. The court system had buried her father, but they made one mistake. They buried him alive. And they left behind a daughter who was still listening, still watching, still waiting, waiting for the moment when she could speak not from emotion but from evidence, waiting to stand where no one thought she belonged, not as a protester, not as a spectator, but as a force of law. And now, that moment had arrived. The trial of Anthony Royce, the high-profile developer whose case had strange ties to Elijah's fall, was back in court. Imani had seen the names, the timestamps, the forged emails. She had connected dots no investigator cared to look at. And when the defense team dropped a subpoena on her father to humiliate him one last time, she knew it was her cue. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked into that courtroom wearing her father's old courthouse badge tucked inside her hoodie and placed a motion on the table. Everyone thought it was a joke until they read what she wrote. The courtroom was already tense that morning. It was day 3 of the Royce corruption trial. Reporters lined the back row, legal interns perched like hawks along the wall, and the defendant sat smug in a navy suit that probably cost more than Elijah Holloway made in a year. Imani entered quietly, papers in hand, eyes calm. She wasn't listed on the docket. She wasn't a lawyer. And she definitely wasn't supposed to be standing at the front of that room. But she was there anyway. "Excuse me, Your Honor," she said clearly. "Before the court proceeds, I request permission to submit a motion of concern regarding testimony being offered against a key witness, Mr. Elijah Holloway." The murmurs began instantly. A few chuckles. One actual laugh from the prosecution bench. Judge Moreno looked over his glasses. "Miss Holloway, is it? What exactly do you think you're doing?" Imani didn't flinch. "Presenting material evidence to protect my father's name and to challenge the credibility of this trial's foundation." That's when the attack began. The defense attorney, a sharp-tongued veteran named Lance Bishop, stood with a theatrical sigh. "Your Honor, this is clearly an emotional outburst from a child. She's not licensed. She's not even old enough to vote. Shall we hand her a robe too?" The courtroom chuckled again. A reporter snapped a picture. Imani's cheeks flushed, but her hands didn't tremble. She pressed forward. "I have documents proving that key timestamps from the Royce Foundation files were altered. Files that implicated my father. The very foundation of this trial." "Enough," Bishop cut in. "This isn't a student debate club. This is federal court." Imani looked toward her father, sitting alone in the third row, eyes heavy, spine bent like he was trying to shrink out of sight. "I know I don't belong here," she said, her voice tightening. "I'm just a janitor's daughter. But so were the facts. Scrubbed out, wiped clean, and someone needs to speak for them." Lance Bishop sneered. "This isn't about speaking. It's about procedure. And this is contempt." He turned to the judge. "I move for her removal and that the court strike any mention of her statement from the record." "Seconded," came a cold voice from the prosecution side. Judge Moreno rubbed his temples. "Young lady, this is highly irregular. The court has no record of your filing. No standing." Imani stepped back for a second. The weight of it all, the cameras, the laughter, the institutional condescension pressed against her like a flood. She felt small, but not broken. Because this moment was always coming. And she'd rehearsed it 1,000 times in her mind at the dinner table, in dreams where her voice didn't shake and her father didn't hang his head in shame. She looked at the bailiff, who was already approaching. Her father stood instinctively. "Your Honor, please." But before he could finish, Bishop smirked. "Of course he speaks now. That's all janitors ever do. Cry foul after the mop's been put away." It was loud enough for everyone to hear. The insult sliced through the courtroom like broken glass. A few snickered. The bailiff touched Imani's shoulder. "Wait," she said softly. "I'll go. But may I say one last thing?" Moreno gave a reluctant nod. Quickly, she turned, not to the judge, not to Bishop, but to the gallery, the public, the students watching, the legal interns. "This system isn't broken," she said. "It's working exactly as designed for the people it was built to protect. But it forgets something. It forgets that people are watching, learning, growing." Then calmly she walked out, humiliated, but not defeated. The courtroom thought it had silenced her, but the story was only just beginning. Imani Holloway didn't cry when she stepped out of that courtroom. She didn't scream. She didn't crumble. She walked straight past the cluster of reporters, her father trailing behind her, confused and quiet, like a man lost in a story too large for his name. But inside her bag was a blueprint. Not of a building, not of a city, but of a system. One she had studied for 3 years, from her dorm room, from the public library, from every corner of the internet they didn't think a janitor's daughter could access. She had learned the court's weaknesses the same way her father once learned to fix broken boiler rooms. Quietly, patiently, with hands stained by experience and eyes wide open. And tonight she wasn't going to bed. She was going to war. Back in her apartment, bare walls, chipped desk, and a second-hand laptop with 2 keys missing, Imani opened a folder labeled simply Operation Dustpan, because that's how they saw her. A cleaner, a nobody. She would use that. Inside the folder were timestamps, archived server logs, a list of names, some public, some hidden behind Foundation shell accounts. But the heart of it? A 3-minute surveillance clip from the Royce Foundation building. Footage that had been lost during the investigation. Footage that showed a junior staffer slipping a flash drive into the central records machine. On the same night, the evidence against her father had appeared. Imani didn't need a badge to know what that meant. She needed witnesses. She needed reach. And she knew exactly where to go. She opened her browser, typed in a private forum for whistleblowers and legal activists. A digital alleyway for those who knew that justice wasn't always blind, just expensive. Her post was clear. No fluff, just facts. "I have footage of fabricated evidence in a federal corruption case. The scapegoat is my father. The truth is in this drive. I'm not asking for attention. I'm asking for allies." Within minutes, she had 6 responses. Within hours, she had 30. One reply stood out. A user named E7 Rising. A law school dropout turned legal analyst who ran a popular justice podcast on the underground circuit. They messaged her directly. "Drop the video, I'll do the rest." Imani hesitated. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a college project. If she uploaded this, she was burning every bridge behind her. But then she remembered the look on her father's face in court, like he'd already accepted the lie. And she hit send. The clip went live the next morning. No press release, no PR team. Just a shaky clip of truth posted with the caption, "This is how they framed a janitor. The internet did what it does best. It caught fire." TikTok edits, Reddit threads, #storms. Justice for Elijah trended by noon. By evening, the courthouse issued a statement. By midnight, someone at the Royce Foundation had deleted their LinkedIn profile. But it wasn't over, because Imani wasn't finished. Using the traction, she launched a petition to suspend the trial-pending investigation of misconduct. The same trial that had laughed her out of the room now had to pause and look back at the door she walked out of. Her inbox exploded. Law students, paralegals, one retired judge, all saying the same thing. "We saw what they did, and we're ready to help you prove it." And in that tiny apartment under a flickering light bulb, Imani sat in silence, not as a janitor's daughter, but as a movement spark. They thought they'd humiliated her, but they'd only handed her the microphone. 3 days. That's how long it took. 3 days from when Imani posted the clip. Grainy, time-stamped, undeniable, until the entire legal department at Royce Foundation was thrown into disarray. It started quietly. A journalist from the Herald Tribune called the court clerk's office, asking for comment. Then the Justice Network ran a 7-minute expose during prime time. The janitor's daughter who outwitted the system. Suddenly, Imani was no longer anonymous. She was everywhere. But fame wasn't her weapon. Proof was. That night, she was invited, no, demanded, back into court. This time, not as a silent observer, but as a witness. The courtroom looked the same. Same cold walls, same judge who had once cut her off mid-sentence. Same smirking attorneys from the Royce Foundation. But something had shifted, because this time, they couldn't ignore her. "Miss Holloway," the judge said, tapping the gavel softly, "we've reviewed your submitted evidence, but for the record, can you clarify its source and authenticity?" Imani stood, spine straight. "The footage was recorded by the Royce Foundation's internal camera system," she said, steady. "It was suppressed, but I obtained a backup copy stored off-site as part of routine cloud redundancy. I cross-referenced the metadata. No edits, no compression, all time aligned with their internal logs." A murmur spread through the courtroom. And then the real twist began. She reached into her worn messenger bag and pulled out a second file, this one marked with a yellow tab. Supplemental, DOJ, correspondence. In it was an email chain between Royce's legal counsel and a Department of Justice contact. Subject line, containment strategy, Holloway case. The emails were cold, surgical. They referenced Imani's father not as a man, but as an acceptable loss, a narrative anchor. The DOJ hadn't just watched the Royce Foundation plant evidence. They had helped script the story. A calculated sacrifice to protect a larger corruption ring involving land zoning fraud, state subsidies, and insider trading, all buried under the floorboards of a janitor's reputation. The court fell silent. The judge blinked. "What? What exactly are you saying, Miss Holloway?" "I'm saying," Imani replied, her voice like a blade wrapped in velvet. "My father was framed by a system that chose convenience over justice, and I have the receipts." The room erupted. Some reporters rushed out to break the headline. Others stayed, phones up, broadcasting history in real time. One of the Royce attorneys stood, flustered. "This is highly irregular. This young woman is not even licensed to practice law." But the judge held up a hand. "She doesn't need a license to tell the truth." From the gallery, a soft clap. Then two. Then the room applauded, quietly, defiantly. Imani turned slightly, eyes locking with her father's. His lip quivered, but he didn't cry. He just nodded. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited, microphones angled. Anchors rehearsed their lines. But Imani didn't stop to speak. She walked straight to the steps and turned around. "For too long," she said, her voice amplified by a dozen live streams. "They've built empires on silence, on people like my father, invisible workers, easy scapegoats, but not anymore. The truth doesn't need permission. It just needs someone willing to carry it." That night, the DOJ issued a statement. An internal ethics review had been initiated. 2 Royce executives resigned. A federal probe was opened. But the most powerful moment came 2 days later. Imani received a letter from the judge, a formal apology, not just for dismissing her voice, but for dismissing her value. It read in part, "You reminded this court that truth isn't a matter of title or pedigree, it's a matter of courage. Thank you." And with that, the girl they called just a janitor's daughter, the woman who made the justice system look at itself in the mirror. The courthouse fallout didn't just shake the room, it cracked open the entire system. Within 48 hours of Imani's court appearance, the Royce Foundation's website went offline, under maintenance. Their social media accounts, once filled with smiling executives and staged charity events, fell silent. Their press team issued a vague statement. "We are committed to transparency and are cooperating fully with authorities." But the damage was already done. The media dubbed it the Holloway Reckoning. Across talk shows, radio stations, podcasts, and panel debates, her story echoed like a stone dropped into still water. This wasn't just about one man's false imprisonment. It was about a culture of erasure, a system that had for years depended on invisible people to stay invisible. Janitors, clerks, cleaners, drivers, people who knew the buildings better than the executives inside them, but whose names were never remembered, never credited, often blamed. Now that was changing. 1 week later, a protest formed outside the Department of Justice headquarters, not just for Daryl Holloway, but for every father, mother, uncle, and cousin who had been crushed by bureaucracy and buried under red tape. Signs read, "Truth has no rank. We are all janitors' kids. Justice needs cleaning too." Imani didn't plan to speak that day, but the crowd chanted her name. So she climbed the makeshift podium, megaphone in hand, and said only this: "They erased my father from the system, but they forgot I was watching." The next day, the Secretary of Justice launched an independent oversight initiative. Operation Floorboard. It aimed to audit every case involving the Royce Foundation over the past 20 years. And guess what? Dozens of inconsistencies surfaced. Payouts disguised as community reinvestment, land grabs using fake environmental reports, confessions extracted under duress, then sealed. Suddenly, senators were being questioned. State officials were taking early retirement. The shockwaves had reached Capitol Hill. But the change didn't stop at the top. In schools across the country, debate teams used Imani's case as a national prompt. Does truth require authority to matter? Law professors invited her to speak, even without a degree. One Ivy League school offered her a scholarship, but she declined. Instead, she used the donations pouring into her GoFundMe, originally created to help her dad buy groceries, to fund a legal literacy nonprofit. She named it Groundswell, Because sometimes change doesn't roar, it rises from the ground, from the janitor's closet, from the girl sitting quietly in the back row, from questions no one wants asked, and answers no one is ready to hear. Back in her neighborhood, murals began appearing. One painted across the old laundromat wall read, "Daughter of the Floors, Mother of Truth." And Daryl? He was exonerated fully. Charges vacated, his record expunged. He walked into the same courthouse where his name was once whispered with suspicion and was handed a medal for public integrity. He didn't say much, just looked at his daughter and smiled. "I used to think all I had to pass down to you was a mop," he said quietly. "But turns out, you picked up something stronger. A broom sweeps dust away, but a voice, it moves mountains." The world didn't change overnight. No banners of justice unfurled in the sky. No fireworks lit up Congress. But something deeper shifted. In quiet offices and echoing hallways, people started asking different questions. Not just who's in charge, but who's watching when no one's looking. Imani Holloway never sought attention. She didn't march into court to be a hero. She did it because her father's silence had been screaming for too long. Because truth, real truth, isn't loud. It's persistent, it waits, it listens, and when it finally speaks, it leaves no room for denial. Her journey wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about flipping tables or burning it all down. It was about precision, grace under pressure, choosing the exact moment to pull the thread that unraveled everything. And that's what makes her story unforgettable. It reminds us that justice doesn't always come in a badge or a robe. Sometimes it walks in wearing old sneakers, clutching a tattered folder, with eyes that have seen too much and still refuse to look away. So what's the lesson here? It's this: don't underestimate the ones the system forgets. Don't assume power comes from position. It can come from memory, from questions, from a daughter who refuses to let her father become a footnote, and never, ever believe that the truth can be buried forever. Because one day someone will come along with nothing to lose. And everything to prove. They called her just a janitor's daughter. Now, she's the reason an entire system had to clean itself up. If you found out that someone society had written off, like a janitor's daughter, held the key to exposing injustice, would you stand by her or stay silent like everyone else? What would you do if the truth meant going against the powerful? Let's talk about it in the comments. Down.